Hello, St. Andrews, and welcome to this fourth and final video conversation about stewardship as part of our spring God the Giver stewardship campaign. And the question I'd like for us to ponder for a few moments today is the question, do Episcopalians actually believe in the biblical practice of tithing? The idea of giving 10% of your income to support the mission and ministry of Christ's church. I was at a diocesan stewardship event recently where someone actually asked me that question. And the answer to the question is a resounding yes. In fact, since 1967, the General Convention of the Episcopal Church, which meets every 3 years, and every 3 years since 1967, the convention has reaffirmed the biblical concept of tithing, giving 10% of your income, as the minimum standard, not the maximum standard, but the minimum standard of giving for Episcopalians, and has strongly encouraged members of the church to begin to practice, or at least move toward, the biblical concept of tithing. So what is a tithe? Well, a tithe, as I said, is giving 10% of your income. Whether it's gross income or net income doesn't really matter, but giving 10% of your income to support what God is doing through the local church. And the tithe is actually mentioned in the Scripture. It's mentioned about 14 times in the Old and New Testament. Most of those references are in the Hebrew Scriptures in the Old Testament. But tithing is most directly related to the fourth foundational principle of transformational stewardship, which we've been talking about here at St. Andrews for several years. And that is the principle of proportional giving. The idea that what matters most is not the size of your gift, but what that gift actually represents in terms of your total income. And the gospel story that provides the kind of foundation and best illustrates this principle of proportional giving is the story of the widow's mite, which appears in the 12th chapter of Mark's gospel and in the 21st chapter of the Gospel of Luke. And in this wonderful story, Jesus actually lifts up the giving of a poor widow and says that she actually gave more in terms of the proportion of her gift than other donors who were giving large and impressive gifts, because she gave out of her poverty everything that she had. So the principle of proportional giving is directly related to the biblical practice of tithing, of giving 10%, calculating your gift to the church on the basis of 10% of your income, whether it's gross income or net income. So it's clear to me that Episcopalians do believe in tithing, but do Episcopalians actually practice the biblical principle of tithing? Now that's a completely different question. And statistics that I've read suggest that the average Episcopalian gives not 10% of their income, but somewhere in excess of 2% of their income. So I really don't have any idea how many members of St. Andrew's Episcopal Church actually practice the biblical principle of tithing. We have several very generous donors, and we thank God for all of our donors. But I have no idea if those donors are practicing the biblical principle of tithing, because I don't have any idea what their income is. But what I can say with certainty is that we have at least two members of St. Andrews who are tithers, and that would be your rector and his wife. Susan and I began calculating our gifts to the church on the basis of giving 10% of our income back in 1977. At the time, we were living and working in Vermont. We were working at an independent school for adolescents with learning disabilities, and we were also attending a small Baptist church, which happened to be pastored by one of my former high school football teammates. Now, this was a very, very conservative church, and they had some very strict requirements for membership in the church, one of which was you had to agree to practice the biblical principle of tithing. Well, Susan and I wanted very much to be members of that church. We were invited to worship and to attend even if we didn't tithe. But if we wanted to be members, we had to make a commitment to become tithers. So we began rather reluctantly, and I have to say, at first it was a little difficult. But over time, and with the encouragement of our pastor and the other members of the church, we found that we could very comfortably give 10% of our income to support the ministry of the church. And we could do it without going into financial freefall. That was our main concern. If we actually gave 10%, would we, experience a financial disaster that we could never recover from? Well, we didn't. That was not our experience at all. In fact, in the years since, and we've been tithing ever since 1977, we've never once regretted making that decision. And in fact, we found that the discipline of tithing has been a great spiritual blessing for us, and it has actually been the catalyst for our own spiritual growth over the years. So, tithing. It's something that Episcopalians believe in, but it's questionable how many actually practice. On Tuesday of this past week, I was driving home from work, listening to NPR as I normally do, and I caught the tail end of an interview with a woman. I didn't even catch her name, but she was talking about prayer. And she was encouraging those in the audience who were kind of skeptical about prayer and skeptical about the positive benefits of prayer. So she challenged them to try to make a commitment to pray every day for 30 days, for a whole month, and then to see at the end of the month if their lives had improved in any significant way. And the thought occurred to me that we could do the same thing with tithing. That we could challenge members of St. Andrew's, especially those who are skeptical about this whole concept, to try a tithe for 30 days and see what the net result of that discipline would be. I'm pretty convinced that you will experience what we experienced, and that is that our fear that if we give 10% of our income to the church, we'll go into a financial freefall is unfounded. And you will experience what we've experienced, and that is that tithing and making a commitment to this discipline is a great spiritual blessing and can be the catalyst for growth in your own spiritual life. And you will maybe discover what the prophet Malachi, and Malachi is the last book of the Old Testament, and actually from the third chapter of Malachi is one of the classic verses of Scripture regarding tithing. And it's going to be our first reading for this coming Sunday. But Malachi challenged the people to put God to the test. Now, this is the only place in Scripture that I know where we are encouraged to put God to the test. And Malachi said, put God to the test, try a tithe, and see if the Lord will not open the windows of heaven and pour down upon you an overflowing and abundant blessing. So that's my challenge to you, especially if you're skeptical about this. Try a tithe. Set aside a month and make a commitment to give 10% of your income and see what benefits will come in your direction. So I hope to see you and your family in church this Sunday on May 20th as our Commitment Sunday, as we complete our spring stewardship campaign. And I pray that God will bless you and will bless your stewardship of life.